Welcome, everybody, to the Across the Sky podcast with our Lee weather team. We have three-quarters of our team again. It is guys afternoon once again here. We have Sean Sublett over in Richmond, Matt Hollander in the Midwest. Kirsten Lang could not make it from Tulsa, but she will be back with us for our next couple of episodes here. And I'm Joe Martucci over at the Press of Atlantic City. Guys, it is like peak summer here. Middle of July, things are kind of slowing down, vacation time. You guys going anywhere anytime soon? Sean?
I'm actually coming up to the Northeast to visit with some of my older kids. So that's going to be fun. But yeah, it's peak summer, man. It is totally peak summer. Here in Virginia, it's just muggy. It's up around 90 every day. So it is totally peak summer.
It's interesting you said the Northeast because, Virginia is kind of on that borderline, Sean.
Oh, dude, we could have like that Central Jersey discussion now if you want to talk about where in Virginia. We can do a whole podcast on geography, which I think we've almost done already.
We almost haven't. Our guest actually grew up in Central Jersey, so
Central Jersey.
Chime in on that. Matt, what's going on? What's going on? Any big plans coming up?
Well, I just got back from a trip. I made my first venture into Michigan, which this is definitely the time of year to go in because it was some gorgeous weather. Right after the 4th of July, I went over to Detroit. I saw the Henry Ford Museum, which is real impressive. I encourage everyone to check that out. That is just a real interesting trip. And then eventually made our way over to Sandusky, Ohio, and went to Cedar Point and rode roller coasters. And I made it through 7. If you're wondering, 7 roller coasters before I hit my roller coaster limit, and that was enough for the day.
How long was the wait on those coasters?
Well, we planned on getting there kind of later in the day. So once we saved the most popular roller coasters for the very end of the day, which the park was open until 11 o'clock at night, which shocked me. And so we crammed about 3 roller coasters in about an hour, which then was really too much. But the longest wait was for one. I mean, we got there in the afternoon, and then the wait was almost an hour. So I definitely encourage everyone, if you want to maximize your number of roller coasters, well, I guess you'd have to get there real early in the day. But you can cram a lot in if your stomach can handle it. If you wait until the very end of the day, then the lines are a lot shorter. But I almost regretted that decision because by the time I walked off that last one, I was like, okay, I'm done. I'm not as young as I used to be. But it is fun. It is like a cool park. And if you like roller coasters at all, you have to go to Cedar Point.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't like Cedar Point like the largest amusement park in the country?
It is the second largest as far as the number of roller coasters. It has 16 roller coasters in total. So I didn't even get to half of them riding 7. So the number of roller coasters is impressive. I think only Magic Mountain in California has more. So it's definitely one of the roller coaster capitals.
Very cool. Very cool. So for our guest, I already teased him. He's from Central Jersey. And if you're listening nowhere near New Jersey, you're probably wondering what's that. If you look up Central Jersey on YouTube, you'll see plenty of videos about the North-South Central divide here. But we have somebody who I know so well. He was actually the best man at my wedding. We've lived together for 2 years, and he is my go-to guy for anything and everything music. But we're not here to talk about music. We are here to talk about energy, commodities, and weather. So without further ado, we're going to introduce Shunondo Basu. Shunondo, what's happening?
Thanks for having me on, and it's great to be with everybody here. Matt and Sean, both of you guys, great meeting you. And let's fire it off and let's get to the questions you guys have. Yeah.
Well, let's start with this because I think when people, non-meteorologists, think of meteorologists, they're probably thinking of people like the 3 of us here, Matt, Sean, and I. However, there's a growing field that works in economics and commodities and energy. And we had Matt Lanz on a couple of weeks ago who went to Rutgers too. Shunondo's a Rutgers guy. I'm a Rutgers guy. Shout out Rutgers. But we had him on as well. But tell me, what got you into energy? Because I remember freshman year, we were both part of the broadcast little community for for Rutgers here with weather. We lived in Perry Hall. The studio was down the hall. We would go make videos. But then at some point, you kind of pivoted over to economics and have been, loving it ever since.
Yeah, exactly. So my journey has been I guess pretty non-traditional in a kind of a way. Funny thing about Matt Lanza, I mean, he was probably one of my earliest mentors, sort of to get me into the space and got me interested into this world. But what's cool is that I think a lot of us at Rutgers and many of maybe listeners around the country that are in undergrad right now go into these meteorology programs like thinking like, oh, like I want to come out being a TV meteorologist, or I want to work for the Weather Service or something like that, and those are great careers, but a lot of us don't realize that there's really a very important place of weather and climate and having a good understanding of that in various Fortune 500 companies or even in finance, which is the sector where I work. So when we were in school, the American Meteorological Society, I mean, that's kind of when they were just starting to really encourage students into exploring this whole interdisciplinary kind of space, right? Like combining weather and climate with, risk management or insurance or finance or commodities or trading energy or whatever it might be. And so for me personally, I still remember to this day that first AMS conference that we went to in New Orleans. Legendary for many reasons, but
very legendary. But that's gonna be another
Yes.
podcast. We can't talk about that here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but for me personally, that was really kind of my first real exposure into this whole world of how weather ties in so tightly with energy and commodities. So, I mean, with certain commodities, especially like, natural gas and power, I mean, weather plays a huge role in determining the fundamentals. And by that, I mean, the supply and demand. And, for somebody working in that market, understanding supply and demand of natural gas, for example, can give you insight into the direction of the price. And so that enables you to do, a lot of things. So as a meteorologist, having some insight into weather, the forecasts, especially in the medium to long range, has a lot of value in that kind of a market. So when I heard about all of this, I was getting exposed to all this, learning about this whole space. I really got fascinated and really interested, and that's kind of what drew me into this world, and that's what I work with now.
As you mentioned before, that a lot of this is medium and long range. It isn't so much today and tomorrow. I'm assuming that's still where most of the work is being done, and that's going to take most of a meteorologist's time, more so than just the next 1 to 2 days with regard to energy demand, with regard to agricultural interests as well, all those things. In some ways, I think, and Shunondo, you talked to this point a little bit, I think that's kind of driven a lot of the more recent work in the last 10, 15, 20 years about longer range forecasting, digging into some of these longer climate oscillations. For those in the know, we're talking about things like the Madden-Julian oscillation. We're talking about the Arctic oscillation, also the North Atlantic oscillation, the quasi-biennial oscillation. Yes, that's totally a thing, y'all. The quasi-biennial, which is why we call it QBO for short.
So racking up the names here.
I know it's acronyms everywhere. So I guess for you, Shunondo, what kind of things did you have to learn very quickly once you went into this realm of meteorology versus a more traditional kind of academic, short-term, dynamic forecasting practicum at Rutgers, or for any place for that matter as an undergrad?
That's a great question. So, I mean, I certainly had to learn a lot, a lot about the teleconnections, and also kind of shifting my focus from, short-term, forecasting, synoptic and mesoscale. That's kind of a, core part of every young meteorologist's education, but kind of shifting from that into, understanding seasonal patterns, looking at teleconnections, understanding the interrelatedness of all those teleconnections as well. I really had to dive headfirst into that. And then, that's just kind of the first piece of the puzzle, right? The main piece is really then turning that into something actionable and insightful for market players that are in the energy and commodities space. even in the asset management and infrastructure space, which is a little bit closer to what I do now, having an understanding of how weather patterns might shift even over longer timescales, over 15, 20, 30 years. How those might shift over time can really affect the way you might examine, say, a wind or a solar asset that is then selling electricity onto the open market. So yeah, there's a lot I had to learn, immediately after undergrad. And to add another point, actually, nowadays, especially with smartphones and apps, I mean, being able to see a 5, 7, or 10-day forecast is as easy as opening an app and just kind of looking at what your weather is going to be in a given area. But for these medium to long range sort of forecasts, that's where the value of, I think, a human meteorologist still is pretty big, because it's not as easy as just running a computer model and looking at the output. I mean, there's a lot of sort of information to synthesize at a more human level, I would say, to really understand nuances of climate models and things like that, and really be able to come up with a valuable medium to long range forecast.
Shunondo, I'm curious to what questions you get, from being in the broadcast side of things. I mean, the most common question we're going to get is it going to rain, and when is it going to rain? That's the big demand from the public, definitely more focused in the short-term range. But in your role, what are some of the questions that you often get? What do people on your side, what are they really wanting to know? What is the most common question that you get for your line of work?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest ones I get is like, what is the upcoming, season X going to be, whether it's winter or summer or spring? Leading up to the winter, it's always like, okay, how cold is this winter going to be? And it's not just about saying like, oh, it's going to be a little colder, a lot colder, but being able to look at a specific region and say like, okay, this region will be 1.5 standard deviations colder than the 10-year normal, and being able to kind of quantify that. That's one example. Similarly, for the spring, in certain areas that might have a lot of, say, hydroelectric power generation, being able to say like, okay, reservoir levels are, some X percentage above the normal value. So those are the kinds of questions I'm often fielding in this space.
All right. I have a real quick question. Then Joe, I want you to jump in. So I have a couple other friends who have been doing this kind of work for a while, and they would tell me, and I don't know if this is still the case, so you let me know, that as new guidance would come in, they could see the markets change instantly. Like, oh, we could tell the new GFS is posted because such and such just went down. Does that still happen?
Yeah. So that's something I've definitely observed. And to some extent, you even get ahead of that where people are trying to forecast the forecast. It's like
trying to find an edge.
Yeah, exactly. But the one thing you have to remember is that everything in finance is based around market expectations. Like, what does the market expect, even if it's not reflective of reality, right? So I think the degree to which a certain market movement, whether it's oil or power or natural gas, is sensitive to a weather forecast, and there's a lot of factors that go into that. But the short answer to your question is yes. I think an output of a certain weather model, especially in a time when markets are more sensitive, it will move expectations and sometimes even prices. Yeah.
All right, wait, I need to back up a little bit. So tell me about this forecasting the forecast part.
Yeah. So let's use, I guess we could use, natural gas as an example, because that's an easy one, right? So in the winter, right, that's, peak heating season, right? So especially when it gets below a certain temperature, like that's when the sensitivity of natural gas demand to weather really goes up a lot, right? So traders and market players and even people hedging are really paying attention to like, okay, the Euro model is saying like, okay, 5 days we're gonna have a cold snap across like the upper Midwest, or the GFS is saying a huge snowstorm in the Northeast and then a deep freeze or something like that, right? Like, people will be paying attention to the models as they're coming out, the 12Z, the 0Z, et cetera, And especially after a certain point, like when people are, when market players are really into it, like people are looking at like, okay, the forecast has trended this way. Like it went from yesterday's 12Z to the 0Z to today's 12Z. And, the forecast has gotten colder over time. So maybe the next run will get even colder than this, or maybe the model will back off a little bit. So we need to take that into account when deciding like, okay, how are we going to trade the market today?
This sounds like being on some of those weather forums and watching the feeds come in right before the winter storm. It's like, oh, it's going 50 miles further south. Is it going to continue? So I didn't know it's the same for weather forums as it is for talking about natural gas. Very interesting.
It's two sides of the same coin, really.
Two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Well, you're running up a situation where a lot of the traders who you would think would come to you for suggestions and advice suddenly think they can do it on their own.
Yeah, I mean, I think so I don't interact with a trading desk directly myself, but what I've observed is that, so, a lot of the bigger desks will have their own mets on the desk to sort of guide them, and they'll have their own commentary and things like that. But, a lot of smaller desks will just rely on third-party mets or service providers and things like that. And that's kind of how it goes these days.
So who are like the big names in this space? What are the big company names or big people in this space? Besides you, of course.
Well, I mean, as far as like firms that are in the energy space, I mean, there's many, right? I mean, all of the major energy companies pretty much have their own trading desks, like, BP, Shell, etc. But you also have smaller players. All the banks have energy trading desks as well that are, taking on various forms of risk. And I think in terms of like actually meteorologists, usually the bigger energy companies will have a meteorologist on staff, like Matt, actually, your guest last week. So that's kind of how that works. Yeah.
Curious for one point that you brought up about how it's based on expectations is really what drives this, and what the expectations are kind of moves the needle. So I'm wondering, how does climate change play into that when you're thinking about, especially the real long term? I mean, even beyond a year, I'm assuming that is playing a role in some of the decisions that are made. Am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think one thing I can tie into with that is, if you're an investor and you're going to say you're going to have a stake in, say, a solar farm that's being built. And actually, you know what, let's use wind for this example. I think that might be a better way to look at this. One thing you're going to probably be concerned about is, over the next 15, 20 years, how will the occurrence of like extreme weather events affect the number of times a wind farm is unable to produce power because of, say, extremely frigid temperatures like we had in Texas last winter or 2 winters ago, or have some kind of a natural disaster that might affect the integrity of said asset, right? That's sort of how that's one way of looking at this. So over longer time spans, that's something really important to pay attention to. The other bit of that might even be actually like shifting weather patterns over a certain region. I think Mexico is actually a great example of this because, there, for example, I know of a number of projects that went up in central Mexico, which is plateau, and over the last 10 or 15 years, like the occurrence of just kind of stagnant areas of high pressure over long periods of time have gone up, and that's affected the way energy has been produced, and it's going to continue to change into the future.
Kind of following up on that, like I read this book called The Grid by, don't want to say the wrong person's name. It was on the New York Times bestseller list, but they were, basically the point of the book, especially in the second half, was we want to go to clean energy, right? It's healthier for the environment, but when you move over to a lot of these wind and solar and a lot of these natural resources, they're more finicky, right? The sun doesn't shine all the time. The wind doesn't shine all the time, but you still need the same amount of power, because unless you have a battery, the power is the power you have at that instant. So how does that parlay into like the work that you're doing? Does that increase the importance of what you're doing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think your question sort of ties into sort of how renewable energy is managed. So yeah, the intermittency of renewables is obviously a well-known thing. Like wind typically produces more at night, and solar produces typically more during the day, right? So the way that energy production is managed, I mean, typically you have day-to-day energy managers that look at that. I don't work in that space, but I do interact with folks who do, right? But with batteries now becoming more and more mainstream, grid scale batteries especially, that's going to help definitely renewable assets produce energy more effectively, right? Being able to produce energy and then store it and then discharge it when they otherwise may not have been able to. Like a solar asset could charge a battery during the day and then discharge it at night during the hours of 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. when energy use is at its peak. And we're going to see more. I mean, definitely going to see more energy storage as we go definitely throughout this decade into the 2030s. The question is really how that energy will be stored, because lithium ion batteries, they're constrained in terms of how effective they can be scaled out on the grid. So we're going to see more different kinds of energy storage technologies, definitely, to help with the storage of renewable energy and renewable power.
Is there anything that and I don't want to get you into trouble, but is there anything that you kind of learned about technologically about storage? I mean, I've heard things like aluminum salts being tossed around, but for now everything seems lithium ion. Obviously that does have some time constraints as well, how fast they discharge. Is there anything that is exciting about storage that you've learned, or is it still we've got ways to go?
Yeah. No, there's definitely a lot of exciting things going on in storage. So not to get too technical here, but just to explain the challenge here, like you said yourself, lithium ion is limited in terms of the duration it can discharge for. And typically that doesn't exceed 4, maybe 6 hours at best right now. And it's difficult to sort of stack these batteries at large or in a big way because of economies of scale. It just sort of doesn't work, to put it simply. So, there's all kinds of technologies like lithium air batteries, vanadium redox batteries. These are, physically larger, so they're more suited for grid applications, not really something somebody would use in your own house, right? But technologies like that are capable of storing power for 10, 12 hours at a time even, and then discharging that for that same kind of duration. So there's a lot of exciting stuff certainly over the horizon. Molten salts, even, I think you mentioned that's also there. So yeah, lot to look out for in the coming years.
Awesome. All right. Well, we're going to take a brief break, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to continue our conversation with my friend Shunondo Basu here. You are listening to the Across the Sky podcast. Welcome back, everybody, to the Across the Sky podcast. We have 3/4 of our Lee weather team here. We have Sean Sublett in Richmond, Matt Hollander in the Midwest. Kirsten Lang could not be with us today, though she will be back with us in the next couple of episodes here. And joined with us, we have Shunondo Basu. Shunondo, we were talking plenty about energy and commodities. Matt Hollander, who is a native Texan, has some thoughts, or at least a question about ERCOT, which is the big energy buzzword out in Texas. Matt, fire away.
Yeah, I feel like I'm representing Kirsten as well, also as a native Texan, because this has just, gotten so much buzz. I mean, ever since, let's be honest, the big winter outbreak in February 2021 and the big power outage that followed, everyone is now nervous. Anytime there's a chance for a lot of storms, anytime there's a chance for real cold temperatures, or most recently, really hot temperatures, an extra hot heat wave in Texas. Texas is used to hot temperatures, but these heat waves by Texas standards are getting worse. And this was another bad one. And so people across the state were asked by ERCOT, which is Texas's energy grid, that's the name for it, to conserve energy during this most Texas heat wave. And I think, what I get just talking to friends back home is, why are we being asked to conserve energy. Can't they just strengthen the grid? Can't they just make improvements? Because we know the climate is changing, the weather is getting more extreme. So what is the problem right now? Why are people being asked to conserve energy during these big events? Is there anything that can be done, or what needs to be done, so that maybe we can avoid that step, and that people can still go about their daily business and not be worried about the power grid crashing? Because that just creates such anxiety for people, and if it does happen, we saw the impacts, causes such a huge inconvenience and can be dangerous. A lot of people lost AC during one of these intense heat waves. We're talking about the number of heat deaths going way up. So, what is your take on the Texas energy situation? What needs to be done to improve the problems?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is like a topic I'm plugged into pretty much every day. No pun intended.
Oh, he got it.
But yeah. So ERCOT, as you said, yeah, it's the Texas power grid, and yeah, I mean, the real question is like, yeah, why is it that the Texas power grid is always in the news, and what's going on with that? So to start things off, it's important to understand that Texas, the ERCOT power grid is actually separate from the rest of the country, right? So, in the US, you have the Eastern power grid, you have the Western power grid, and then you have Texas, which is kind of its own thing. And typically, what happens anywhere else is, when you have a shortage of electricity in one region, sometimes you're able to import electricity from another one, right? That's common across the Midwest, across portions of New England and areas like that. But Texas is a little bit limited in terms of how much power they can actually import from its surrounding neighbors, right? So that's one reason why, whenever temperatures go really high or really low, electricity demand explodes, and so the grid automatically becomes supply constrained. The second reason is that you have or what's referred to as the reserve margin, which is basically the amount of, you can think of it as the amount of spare capacity that the Texas power grid has. It's pretty slim. It's lower than its peers, and it's lower than other various other power grids around the country, right? And there are various reasons for that. I'm not going to get into that portion right now, but just know that reserve margin, or the amount of spare capacity, is low, right? So when you have these extreme weather conditions, it creates a good deal of concern in terms of like, okay, will there be enough electricity to go around to all customers within ERCOT, right? So one interesting thing actually we've seen in this past week, so there were actually 2, I believe, calls for conservation so far this week alone from ERCOT itself. A note went out to all customers saying like, okay, conserve power to the extent possible, because demand is going to go really high, and supply may not be able to keep up, right? Remember, everything is about supply and demand here. But the interesting thing is what happened was that crypto miners in Texas were able to curtail or reduce the amount of energy that they use. So much so that it was, like about 2 to 3%, which in energy terms is a lot. And by reducing the amount of electricity they use during peak hours of the day, or the hottest times of the day, they were able to, keep the grid stable, keep everybody's lights and ACs going, and, avoided any real issue or any major event. So that's something going forward. I mean, especially as, we see more crypto mining activities around the country. Now, Texas, has been very friendly to crypto miners from both a tax perspective and in other ways, which is why there's a good presence of them down there. But yeah, that's really what happened this week, and it was a pretty big deal.
So thank you, Bitcoin.
Specifically, yeah, the people that are mining it. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, people who are mining Bitcoin, for avoiding a catastrophe.
Yeah, some of the stuff is just really wild. Matt, did you have anything to follow up, or because I got another question that's a little bigger?
I just want to kind of maybe mention how much of it, is for things like crypto mining, and how much of it is that the fact that Texas population is just exploding. I mean, every time I go back to Texas, there is new stuff, more homes. So as part of this, not just that temperatures are getting hotter and weather is becoming more extreme, but also that the population of Texas is increasing. So I guess that's adding to the demand as well. And what can be done to act like can any adjustments be made to the grid in the short term, as the population increases, to actually strengthen it instead of asking for the conservation and trying to reduce the amount of Bitcoin mining that's going on? What needs to happen to the grid? Because we know that Texas population is probably going to increase. Temperatures are probably going to get hotter in the summer. So what needs to be done to fix the problem?
Yeah. Great question. So that kind of ties in with the whole like physical resiliency of the grid. So it's one thing to actually build enough power generators, enough wind farms, enough solar farms, gas plants, etc. But it's another thing to connect them to the grid and then make sure the power flows as efficiently as possible around the grid, right? And that's kind of where grid resiliency comes in. So one issue with ERCOT, and improvements are ongoing, of course, is that there are pockets of the ERCOT power grid that, to use a little bit of a technical term here, they're very congested. And what that means is that there are pockets of a lot of generators that are, concentrated in one area, but they can't all send their power out to the areas of high demand, like the cities and the load centers, to satisfy that demand, right? So that's one area that a lot of grid investment needs to be made, and we're going to only see a greater need for this as time goes on, with more EVs coming on, customers buying more EVs, data centers being built out, of course, more crypto mining activities. Crypto is a big consumer of energy. The need to actually have a more robust power grid that's able to handle more electricity and distribute that electricity around is only going to grow.
Yeah, so we've got that, of course, domestically. We talked a little bit earlier about resources, energy resources. How much of the work that in this field in general, not necessarily what you're doing, but in general, is more global in scope? I mean, obviously the U.S. is first world country, so we've got a lot to take care of here. But when you look at the big teleconnections, you look at where we need to sell or conserve resources, buy resources, nat gas, whatever. How much of what you're doing is global percentage wise versus domestic?
So yeah, in my work, I am looking at things globally for sure. And I mean, issues faced by the US is really only a fraction of electrification problems or challenges around the world, right? The way, you're going to build out EV charging in the US and Canada is vastly different from the way you're going to build it out in Southeast Asia or in India, for example, right? One point I can bring up there is actually decentralized energy, right? We hear, the word decentralized these days as a pretty big buzzword, and it applies to many things, but energy is certainly one of them, right? In areas that, like, in developing countries, for example, like if somebody has like an electric motorbike, for example, how are you going to charge that if their home gets electricity for only 5 hours of the day, right? The answer to that is decentralized electrification by either rooftop solar panels or microgrids and things like that, and those are all topics and technologies that we're paying attention to.
I'll go. Looking at what's going on in terms of gas prices being very high, of course, everything with that, barrels of oil. Does that have anything to do related to what you're working in now?
Yeah. I mean, it's all connected, really. No commodity operates in its own little silo, right? So yeah, I mean, gas prices and oil, I mean, that's something that's in the news every single day. That's something people really feel when they go with their car to the gas station. And that ties into energy and power in a big way as well. So, with Europe right now, because there's a shortage of natural gas, and Europe does depend a lot on natural gas-fired power generation, with the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, natural gas in Europe is at a critical shortage seen really never before, right? So what that means is that now Europe has to turn to more coal and oil-fired power generation specifically to sort of fill in that gap. left by natural gas, right? So what does that mean, right? It means that if they're using more oil now for power generation, there's less oil left for the rest of the world, which is in turn going to drive up prices, unfortunately. That's just one of the ways I can, this all sort of ties together.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is any of it related to the weather that we've seen over the past couple of weeks and months, really? I mean, gas has been over $4, well, at least here in Jersey, for months at this point.
Yeah. I mean, there's, again, everything is connected, right? So, for example, right now, hydro levels across a lot of the Nordics and even Southern Europe are at historically low levels, like Spain, Portugal, but also going all the way up to, the Scandinavian countries. Like hydro generation so far this year has been below the 5-year normal, which means that in turn they have to use more fossil fuels to, satisfy demand around their countries, right? And so in turn, that affects many things downstream. So kind of being able to look at these climate and weather sort of occurrences, like they had less rain throughout the spring and a less snowpack over the winter, that in turn affects a lot of these things downstream.
Considering that we're talking about oil prices and that it's hurricane season, I think I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the role that hurricanes play in all of this. So how much of it is based on the seasonal forecast for how many storms are forecast, and then what happens during the course of the season? Because we know when a hurricane goes in the Gulf, all those oil rigs have to shut down. So you're talking about the supply going down. So that's kind of what concerns me as we get into the peak of hurricane season, is that we're going to see the supply even limited more, because we know that at some point there's going to be a tropical system, probably multiple, in the Gulf of Mexico and in various other places. And so that could, just as prices maybe start to get a little bit better, maybe they're going to start to go up. But I'm just curious how much of it has to do with the seasonal outlook, and then what is the role that during the hurricane season, what goes on in this realm that controls how oil prices might fluctuate based on the number of storms that are out there or what they're forecast to do?
Yeah. I was waiting for this question to come along. So, this is really topical right now, right? And here's why. So, when you have a hurricane, with this season, we're still in a La Nina, right? And I think the forecast officially from the Hurricane Center is I think an above average hurricane season with more named storms than usual. So what that means is that in a time like right now, where the global amount of oil in storage is so low, if you get even the smallest disruption from a hurricane or any other kind of weather event that's going to impact, oil production, or say natural gas exports, LNG exports, which is, gas transported via ship, that's going to wreak havoc on the markets, probably more than anything, we've seen before. And here's why, right? The way to think about this is that, commodities of just, really quick, commodities, many of them can be stored. And the concept of being able to store commodities means that storage acts as a sort of shock absorber. If you have a lot of oil or a lot of natural gas in storage, and that storage is filled to the brim and it's high, and you get an event that knocks a bunch of production offline like a hurricane, markets won't really be worried, because you have a lot of that commodity in storage that's, just ready to be used. But in a time like right now, we are globally short refined products, we're short gasoline, we're even more short diesel, and we're short crude, barrels of crude oil. If you get a major hurricane that goes through the Gulf Coast and shuts down, these rigs or some refineries, that's really, really going to throw the markets in for a spin, most likely. Now, the flip side of that argument is, you could say that globally we're heading into a period of slower economic activity, maybe a recession around the corner, so it may not be felt as much, and that certainly is a possibility. But that's kind of how that works there.
It's not a weather question, but you mentioned diesel and how short it is. And actually, I was talking about this with somebody last week. I feel like maybe, I don't know, when we were kids, Shunondo, in the 90s and 2000s, diesel was cheaper than gas, but now it's more expensive than gas. Am I wrong, or is that correct? And why is that?
That's a great question. So that's a little bit more structural. So what happened at a point, now is, diesel now, when you go to the pump, sometimes you see something that says ULSD, which stands for ultra low sulfur diesel, right? So taking those impurities out of the refining stream when you're refining diesel, that costs money and adds to the price, right? So that's one reason you see a premium for diesel over gasoline. The other thing is, in the US specifically, at least, our refineries are configured actually to produce more gasoline per barrel of crude oil than diesel. And so globally, the refinery configurations have sort of shifted over time, and just the nature of how that's happened has kind of led to this premium that we see now at the pump, where diesel is more expensive than gasoline. Great question, though.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Not a weather question. Just thought you might know the answer to it. Sean, did you have something? I'm sorry.
No, I was just thinking about what you said before. Back in the day, when with the cost of diesel, I don't remember it being substantially less than gasoline. Once I was a kid in the 70s, but no, I don't remember it being this much more comparatively to gasoline, because I think diesel still has this kind of connotation here in the States that diesel is dirty. And it's not necessarily the case anymore, but I still think that connotation plays out here in the States.
And Shunondo, as we're getting kind of close to wrap time here, what have we not covered yet that you would like our audience to know about your line of work? What is something that you think is like a big takeaway, the thing that maybe people just, something we haven't talked about yet, but you'd really like people to know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's crazy. I think that the more I work in this world, in this universe, like, I just kind of realize there's so much out there that I myself don't know, and there's so much to constantly learn. But for an end user, list one of your listeners, right? Like, there's a lot of changes coming over the next decade with the way I think really everybody will consume and use energy. I think that the biggest place we'll see that is probably in personal transportation by way of EVs and automobiles, right? I think there have been surveys out there that have said that 2/3 of surveyed Americans want their next car to be an EV and not a gasoline vehicle, right? That is going to be a huge shift, definitely over the next 10 years or so. So that's something to look out for. And tying in with that, actually, I think energy storage and battery technology, like even for the everyday consumer, there are some really exciting developments ahead, which I think will be exciting for everybody to look out for.
Awesome. Well, Shunondo, thanks a lot, my man, for coming on. We appreciate it. Do you want to maybe give a Twitter handle shout out?
Of course. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, so I don't do a whole lot of tweeting myself, but if you have any more questions, you could certainly send me a DM on Twitter. My handle is @NondoB, NONDOB. And, it was great being on with you guys. I really like this. This is a great discussion.
Yeah, I actually learned a lot here today. So that was cool. And I know I had you on our Press of AC Something in the Air podcast. So we got you up here, and we'll certainly reach back out to you when some kind of big, maybe grid problems going on with the weather, and we can get your insight. In the meanwhile, we appreciate it. Thanks. I'll talk to you soon.
It's my pleasure.
Thanks to Shunondo Basu again for hopping on the podcast here. I have to say, I think he did a good job. I might be a little biased, but all in all, I actually learned some things, and I talk to him all the time. So I want to know what you guys thought.
Yeah, I mean, that stuff is absolutely fascinating. The how much weather, energy, business, agribusiness, all that stuff is so interconnected at levels that most of us really don't understand. So to bring somebody in like him, and of course Matt Lanza from several weeks ago, really gives us a lot of insight as to how that world works. And like, hey, this is really why the gas prices are the way they are, y'all. It's way up there above our heads.
Yeah, I would encourage everyone to go check back in our episode. If you're just now discovering the Across the Sky podcast, go back into our list and look for summer outlook and weather forecast for the energy sector. That was the name of the episode. We had Matt Lands on. We got into this a little bit, but yeah, I still learned more this time around. One of the things, we were talking about ERCOT and the energy situation in Texas. And one thing I didn't think about that's playing a big role that Shunondo brought up is crypto mining, and how what maybe saved the grid from crashing this time around during the heat wave was that the crypto miners, fortunately, backed off a little bit and reduced the amount that was being consumed. But cryptocurrency is currently getting bigger. The Texas population is only getting bigger. So I hope that will continue in the future, because we know there are going to be more heat waves in Texas and more people moving on, adding more demand to the grid. So if you're adding cryptocurrency on top of that, I just never thought about, how much energy that does consume. And it's going to be a balancing act in Texas, unless they figure out a way to really back up the reserves and get better prepared for these extended heat waves. Or if a hurricane makes landfall in Texas, that just creates a lot of unnecessary anxiety for people. So I hope this is a situation that it definitely needs to be, discussed more, because this is the future, and we got to start, preparing for it now.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear from him in regards to, like, first of all, just how you get interested in that kind of field, right? Because again, just tying back to what we said, you think of meteorologists, you're probably thinking of people like us, and that is certainly a number of us, and we enjoy that. But what Shunondo's doing, what Matt Lands is doing, I have another friend of mine who graduated with a meteorology degree and got his doctorate in communications, and now talks about communicating the weather, not to the public, but talking to people like us on how to communicate. There's just a lot of different fields in weather, and doesn't even involve forecasting the weather each day. So we're going to try to show you more of those kind of people as we go forward in time, to show you what else is out there and how what meteorologists are doing that impact the world beyond, hey, here's what's happening over the next 7 days, and hey, watch out for this severe thunderstorm warning. That's important too, but also work that Shunondo's doing and others are important as well. So with that, I think we can wrap it up. Do we have any final thoughts before we wrap up here for today?
No, I think that's good, Joe. And just to emphasize what you said, a lot of us, like you, me, Matt, Kirsten, and our TV colleagues, we're the face of weather, right? But we're less than 10%, easily less than 10% of actual meteorologists across the country. There's so many people that you've never heard of and never seen who do some very important work.
Yes, they do. So with that, we are going to wrap up the Across the Sky podcast, brought to you by Lee Enterprises here. I'm Joe Martucci at the Press of Atlantic City. We have Sean Sublett from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, Matt Holliner, who covers all and even beyond some of the Midwest. Kirsten Lang from the Tulsa World. She's now with us. Well, she'll be back with us next week here. Hey, Sean, before we actually finally wrap up, who do we have coming up?
Next week, we have Kathy Dello from NC State. She is the state climatologist for the state of North Carolina. As we mentioned at the outset here, we are in peak heat. This is July. So we're going to talk about extreme heat and global warming / climate change, whatever you want to call it. What can we say? What can we not really say about what's going on out there? So that's next week.
Yeah.
Should be another interesting show.
Always
it should be an interesting show. It will be hot for the rest of this week, I know, in a large portion of the country. So if you're in those sweltering hot places, hope you're staying cool and staying safe. And we'll be back with you next week.